relationships.
Well, it's been a few weeks.
Like one or two.
It's maybe been an entire month.
Maybe three. It's
So,
been more than a month, I think.
I think it has been more than a month.
Welcome back, everyone.
Yep, and fear not, because we're back.
Oh,
And
yeah. So back.
boy, are we back.
Yeah. And we have our special guest, returning special guest, Shayla.
Hey, everybody.
And in case you haven't noticed, at least 1/3 of all our guests get engaged.
Wait, who else did we have?
Well,
that got
I'm
engaged?
trying to remember. Well, I'm just thinking 1 out of 3. I can't remember because how many other guests do we have on? Well, with the
We've had
Nickersons,
several.
the
Some of them
Nickersons
were already married.
We're
so
already
they don't
married,
count.
so
Anyway.
I think we can take credit for
Yeah,
that.
we'll talk about that in a bit. But I just want to let you guys know that all that time we spent away was so we could prepare an extra awesome episode, which
be
is
real
this
good.
one. It's probably, I don't want to brag, but it's probably going to be the best podcast episode that we've ever done, and probably that's ever been made in the history of podcasts.
I think so.
Yeah, and even it's probably going to be the best media you've ever experienced in your life.
Yes, of all media.
Like podcasts or anything else.
Or
combined.
movies, books, the whole thing.
So, well, really
Yeah.
setting a high bar
I'm not
here.
bragging. I'm being factual here.
Okay.
Let's wait till the end to make that kind of declaration.
Yeah, okay. Fair
Yeah,
point. Fair point. But we have put a lot of work into this.
But you can probably expect to see us at the podcast awards if there are,
Podcast Grammys.
if there is such a thing.
Yeah.
Should be.
So we wanted to start out with just, well, first of all, the topic today is the other Cold War, which is an analogy that we've vaguely referenced several times. And specifically, we're going to be talking about differences between men and women, which is something we've talked about, here and there before. Before we get into that, though, I just wanted to give some personal updates from our lives. I'll just start with me. Shayla has the most exciting of all, but for me, so I'm doing coaching again, among the other entrepreneurial things I'm doing. So this is just a shameless plug, on this podcast that I am once again doing relationship coaching. If you're interested to learn more, just reach out to me. That's all I'm going to say about that for now, but I'm excited to work with you if you want to work with me.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as long as we're giving shameless plugs, if you need help with intellectual property, I'm your man.
That's true.
PaulJohnsonLaw.com.
Dude,
I've actually. Oh, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
go ahead. I wasn't going to say anything other than dude.
I haven't been having any interpersonal conflicts in my business, but I've been having an internal conflict because there's these kind of fuzzy ethical rules about what am I allowed to do for clients that are not in the same state as me, or the state where I'm licensed and not, and so yeah, been having to deal with that. This is gray area. It may or may not be the unauthorized practice of law in another state if I do this specific thing for this client. So I don't know. Anyways,
Yeah.
Maryland bar, you know what I'm talking
Yeah.
about.
So if you're looking for a lawyer who knows what it's like to deal ethically with murky rules, Paul's your man.
Yeah, exactly. The nature of and people always ask me this, like they're in another state than me. They're like, "Can you represent me for this?" For patent and trademark law, usually yes, because it's federal law. But there's some murky areas.
How did that affect your relationships?
Well,
human
like for
relationships?
example, one time a client asked me to do something, and I said okay, and then afterwards I reflected on the ethical rules, and I had to come back to them and say like, actually, I think you probably need a local attorney to do this because this probably invokes state law, and technically I'm not allowed to practice your state law where you are,
And that really hurt your relationship.
Well, they got a little bit disappointed, but they're still my client. So,
Oh, that's cool.
so we healed, man.
Yeah! That's what we're all about here.
They got all talkative about it, and I went into my cave. No, just kidding. That's just a foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Anyways, Shayla's got updates.
Yeah, so I have an update with no shameless plug. I'm getting married. Yay, congratulations to me.
Yeah, way to go.
I went on vacation and I met this amazing man. His name is Paul, which we will be calling him D. Paul on this podcast, so we don't confuse him with our own podcast Paul.
and so he sounds like a rapper. But
He sounds like a rapper. He's an amazing man. So there's my update.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? About this whole thing?
About being engaged?
Yeah.
It's awesome. It's great. It's long distance relationship because I met him on vacation, so he doesn't live here. And that's hard, but it actually gives us quite the amazing opportunity to talk through a lot of things, cultural differences, things that you wouldn't necessarily talk about in relationships so early on, but we've had to because of distance and because of the way we have to talk to each other. It's been really great, and it's helped me see a lot of sides of him that I wouldn't necessarily see so soon into a relationship. So.
Wait, but if it's real love and if it's meant to be, shouldn't there be any of that? Should there be nothing of that?
Should there be nothing of
things to work through?
Well, I don't know if it works that way.
This might not be the right one. This might not be the right one.
I mean, as much as I believe in fairy tales, I think relationships take a lot of work.
I don't know about
Bryce,
that.
This may be why you're single. Yeah. We'll talk later.
Yeah. I'm obviously being facetious. Although she's not wrong. In whatever personal ways, yes, that is an issue that keeps me single. She's not wrong on that. Anyway, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
You escaped.
I'm very excited.
Or you're escaping.
I will be escaped soon.
You are escaping. Right now, you're escaping the black hole.
Yeah.
Miracles.
Better, and in some ways harder, but definitely better things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
really
sure. Singlehood isn't a black hole, but you know what I mean.
I get it.
Yeah. So now, Shayla is an expert on relationships.
Pretty much.
That's how it works, right?
Pretty much.
Like married people are all experts.
She gets married.
I suddenly know everything.
Yeah.
Someday you guys will see. It's great.
You put on your married goggles and you're like, oh, you.
Now you can start setting single people up.
Silly person.
Like, oh,
I'm on it.
Yeah. Now I know.
There's my shameless plug. If you need to be set up on a date, I have a lot of amazing friends.
That being said, Shayla is she's a very smart, very with it person. I would trust her recommendations more than most people's.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. So things are happening in our lives.
Yeah, they are.
Okay. Anyway, so on to the podcast. So, so this analogy of the other Cold War, it's a little bit mysterious, I hope. It deserves some explaining. Essentially, in our day and age, even though by the numbers, there's less war in the world than in previous, generations.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
like,
by the numbers, like
just by the numbers
engaged in armed conflict.
Are fighting.
People killed in wars. It's low. I mean,
not many things
there's
that
some
can
big
compare to
outliers
like
there,
World
like
War
World
II.
War One and Two.
World War One, yeah, those
but
huge.
yeah, I mean.
That's
social media probably just makes it seem like there's more.
Yeah, I mean, there's still conflict, like armed conflict, absolutely. So we live in a world where there's not as much armed conflict, but still enough that we pay attention. But when it comes to interpersonal conflict, I think people are as conflicted with each other as they've ever been.
Sure. There's threat of armed conflict, like people talk big.
No, that's true.
I wonder if there's more than that than there was before.
Don't. Okay, but basically what I'm getting at is that there is strife and conflict within people, within individuals, internal conflict, as well as between people, lots of it. And it doesn't necessarily come to outright, verbal arguments and, physical violence. Sometimes it does, but to me it seems that we're kind of in a state of Cold War when it comes to human relationships.
Okay.
That there are rifts, even existential rifts, like you saw in the original Cold War, right?
Yeah.
Where the U.S. and Russia felt that for one to exist, the other had to not exist, right? That they couldn't. There was no reconciling. So that's where this analogy comes from. And we see this in the data. There's more single people than ever before, more divorces than ever before. More abuse. Part of it is that we just know more about this. There's more opportunities to not be married, but we also know that relationally people aren't doing that great.
Sure. I think we've talked on earlier episodes too. We finished with your thought, Enrique.
Oh, yeah.
Like we've talked in earlier episodes about how marriage has changed in our culture and in other cultures, and that you maybe didn't. There are things that are important now that maybe weren't as important back then, but maybe to some extent because of that, where we feel like either consciously or subconsciously that we can afford to nitpick a little bit about person's personality and communication, things like that. We can go into more depth about what's wrong with the person to some extent, perhaps.
You're saying that our knowledge gives us more ammunition for the conflict?
To some extent.
Our knowledge and also
I think
just our ease ability to be independent and
and some of that's good.
Marriage has changed. Yeah, some of it is good. Like, but for example, like you kind of joke in past episodes. Well, he's not a drunkard, so he's a good guy.
That's right.
Whereas, and maybe in like Wild West days, that was a big deal.
Sure, yeah.
Or whereas now, I mean, not to make light of that, there are people that have struggles with alcohol nowadays, but that on average, people probably worry less about that kind of thing. But we can be a little bit more picky about like, well, I don't like that he or she does this or that. Yeah. And there's some more Cold War stuff going in there, maybe.
Absolutely. I think, again, some of pickiness is about mitigating our risk, and some of it is about increasing our return on investment. Yeah. And to the extent that our information and our biases, exist, and are inaccurate, the more we hamper ourselves.
Sure. Yeah. I think most good DTRs involve the
DTRs
phrase
define the relationship.
Oh yeah, sorry. Sorry. I think most of the DTRs involve the phrase return on investment.
That's true. Because who doesn't discuss the relationship in terms of financial return and risk?
With a notepad and your glasses. I've been calculating the return on investment here.
It's not looking
good. Yeah. I hear women really swoon over that. Yeah.
Shayla? They do.
I'm not going to say anything.
I launched straight from that into a discussion about black holes. Anyways.
So one of Paul's big concerns is about the eventual heat death of the universe. And let's not get too much into it. But,
it's not actually a concern, but it fascinates me. It's more that I find it fascinating because of my religious background and how I don't think it's actually possible from a religious background. But
that's for another time.
Anyways, yeah.
Okay, so getting back on track. So, as we see it, and I think it'd be hard to argue otherwise, but, relationally, people are divided in society, and whether that's romantic relationships or not. Ultimately, our goal with this podcast is to be peacemakers, to help give people information that can help them, to do things better in their own lives. I think to do that, we need to talk about and understand the pain and the conflict, though, and that's kind of what we're getting at with this. I really like.
Right, we're not like the Switzerland here. We're more like United Nations, proactively. Okay, anyways.
That's not a flattering. That's right. We don't do anything, but we exist.
Okay, we're not like Switzerland, but we're better than United Nations. Okay, go ahead.
I really like in the Hebrew language, the word for peace is shalom, which which entails not simply the absence of conflict, but also goodwill, prosperity, safety, and well-being. And in my view, there's a big difference between simply the absence of conflict and the promotion of those other things like goodwill. I think the latter, goodwill, is more proactive and deliberate, and it actually means something. That there's actual care for the other person. Absence of conflict is more passive, and it isn't necessarily interested in the well-being of others. So we're really about promoting goodwill. I think that's a lifelong process.
Like instead of like, I hope nothing bad happens to you when you part from someone.
Sure.
I hope something good happens to you.
That's right. And I guess in terms of wanting to promote peace, that's what I mean by that we want to promote goodwill.
Sure.
Yeah. Which there is a component of eliminating conflict, certainly, but it's also about, having people's best interests at heart.
Yeah. Awesome. Good.
Any other thoughts?
That's what we need. I think we need to promote good stuff, man.
Yeah.
I think that especially like married relationships, romantic relationships. I think that's part of the point, is to be able to become better. Both people to become better.
Yeah.
And that I don't know. Yeah, the absence of conflict is great. Actually becoming better, and I don't know, wishing good things upon each other, trying to help those things kind of pass is it's like a good, better, best kind of thing.
And I would even argue that when you know, goodwill, it enhances the ability to make peace. You know, if you don't actually have any interest in the other person's well-being, you're not as invested in getting past conflict.
I think a big part of relationships is selflessness, and goodwill is giving up some of your selfishness, whereas just having peace, you can still be selfish and not give up part of that. I don't know if that makes sense.
That's good. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
No, that's totally true. I feel like my most satisfying relationships have been the ones where I felt the deepest levels of selflessness as well, you know, and it's a unique feeling as a single guy. I don't feel like I feel that super often, you know, I mean, I don't have to, I guess, but in relationship, comes about.
It's a very selfish stage of life.
I think there's more of that desire among single men than maybe is obvious. You know, that we want to be in that place where we, you know, give all to the other person.
Honestly, for me, like the first time I was in kind of like a serious relationship and started to feel it, I was like, whoa. I was like, that's interesting, kind of a cool experience. I was like, I don't know. I mean, I imagine I would probably have a similar reaction to having a child or something. You know, like, whoa, cool, selfless feelings that are positive and stuff. Yeah. But that you don't really get a chance to feel when you're just living your life by yourself and, you know, I mean, dating. But
even the difference between dating and being engaged, I've noticed, like, suddenly I'm giving so much more of myself in ways that I never really did before because I'm committed, like fully committed, and not just like committed to this person while we're dating.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You have become a lot better of a person, Shayla.
Thank you. I'm glad you could see that.
You were pretty good before. You were okay. No, just kidding. Shayla was always wonderful, and now she's even better.
Yeah. You've gone up like 2 tick marks or something.
No, that's what I was hoping for.
Maybe more.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on with the outline, because we have a lot to talk about that we won't get to all of it. But, okay, so we're taking it as a given that there is a rift between people in general as well as between the genders specifically.
Yep.
I think the size and the nature of that rift can vary immensely among individuals. For some people, the gender divide manifests as relatively minor nuisances to calmly and peacefully work past in the day-to-day of committed relationships. There might not be like outright conflict necessarily, but you know, there may still be challenges to like connect in meaningful ways. For others, it's more tumultuous. There might be distrust, tension, or outright conflict and fighting, which test the patience and resolve of the people in the relationship, sometimes past the breaking point. So there's you know, I think dealing with interpersonal conflict is a fact of life, but some people are handling it are in a better place than others.
Yeah, I think also, you know, I mean, one of the ways this manifests is that we just talk to other people about the opposite gender in negative ways, you know?
Oh, yeah.
What I'm just thinking of, I mean...
Well, that does never happen, Paul.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so it just starts with, like, negative thoughts, like, females, you know?
Yeah.
Or males. But of course, it turns into talking, and like we were talking a little bit offline about this, like, I think women probably, because they're more verbal in general,
which we'll get into.
They might talk more often about negative aspects of men. Men probably tend to think about it internally more and talk about it less, but they do talk about it with other guys. Yeah. And then, of course, talking with the other gender about it too. I mean, how many conversations have we been in where like it's men and women in a group and we're talking about the differences in each other and what's good and bad and stuff like that, you know? And I've been in several of those too.
Yeah.
I had a friend just
it
the other
always
day.
Ends well.
Yeah,
I had a friend just the other day who was telling me something negative about this date she went on, and I said, and she's like, so I'm just done. And I said, but that's not a reason to write somebody off. But in her mind, that was the reason to be done with it. And it's not necessarily a rift. It's like a fixable thing.
Yeah. You know, and that just goes to show that, like, I think thinking about and talking about challenges we encounter is important. It's not the only thing. Learning how to actually do something constructive with that is the next step. Yeah. And that's harder. But we're going to talk about it, or that's what we're trying to get at here. So I think it's also worth noting that, you know, there's some conflicts and some differences that we encounter that they have nothing to do with gender. Well, they don't have to do with gender specifically as much as just with
being human.
Exactly. Connecting with humans. You know, some of these might seem to be about gender, but it's really about the relationship. You know, if we're having some sort of conflict with, you know, in a romantic text, to us that may seem like, oh, this is what I encounter in all dating things. But really, this is something you'd encounter
with anybody,
with other important relationships that you have. Yeah. Yeah. You know, and I think that's just because human relationships are complex and challenging. And they're rewarding. So,
we wouldn't grow if they weren't challenging to some extent.
That's true. That's true.
It's very true.
So there's this other podcast that Paul and I listen to. It's the Relationship Matters podcast. It's really good. It's all based on social science research about different relationship issues. They've opined several times that there's actually more variation among genders than between them. You know, or in other words, you know, they really, well, the sense I've gotten is that they really think that the gender differences are overblown. And personally, I think there is truth to that. I think there is a great deal of variation within genders. But I also think there's some certain general differences between the genders which can matter. And that's really what we're going to talk about in more detail.
I agree as well. And as a side note, you can't find that podcast on Podcast Provider. So if you're thinking about listening to it, you just have to go to the website and listen to it.
Relationship Matters.
But it's interesting stuff.
Yeah. One more thing I want to add. When we talk about human differences, I think gender is definitely a difference, you know, a legitimate difference. But it's not the only one, right? There's culture, there's personality, there's, you know, your family upbringing, there's your socioeconomic status, and so forth. So
yeah, drunken state.
Yes, your current level of addictedness to substances.
Drunkardness. I don't know how to all right.
Yeah.
Sorry, all you who struggle with alcohol. I don't mean to be.
Yeah, it's a serious challenge.
Yeah, it is.
But still something we can joke about.
Yeah, sure, totally.
Yeah.
Sure sounds good. When you were talking there, it was making me think just anecdotally about, you know, after my dad had passed away, my mom and dad had like kind of fallen in love through letters. And I went through and read their letters. My mom let me read through them.
That's cool.
And there was definitely conflict in the letters.
Interesting.
And it was interesting to see how they worked through things. But there was this one point where they had this really big fight about religion. They came from different religious backgrounds. And there was a big conflict about whether or not they were going to go forward or not. And as I was reading through those letters, I had this like Back to the Future experience where I was imagining us all kids disappearing from the photographs. Like,
your hand is disappearing.
An existential threat. And, and then it was interesting to see how they worked through it. But yeah, I know they did work through it. But yeah, and just anyways.
That's awesome.
Kind of
instead of exasperatedly saying, women, men, they can't be reasoned with.
Yeah,
I give up.
And also, it was interesting to me because that's a big, huge thing. Like, you know, different religious backgrounds is pretty big.
Yeah.
Because you got to think to yourself, like, well, what are we going to do when our kids get older? What are we going to teach them?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You know, we're going to disagree about that. As one of us going to go to one religion, the other one the other.
And what is important to you? You know, what are your values?
Yeah. And in the end, they kind of just like agreed to like not talk about it for a long time. So it was kind of like
there's some utility to that.
Decent amount. They decided to get married. They hadn't figured this problem out yet, but they decided to get married and go forward. Yeah. And they just didn't. But actually, my mom actually ended up converting to my dad's religion later, and it was a legitimate conversion. But then she had struggles because her family didn't like that. And so then she stopped being active in the religion. So for about 8 years, they kind of just didn't go to church, neither of them, and just kind of didn't really talk about it. Later, things kind of changed, and they both felt like they kind of went through another conversion process.
That's cool.
Felt like they were able to both feel at peace about going to church again and going to the same church. Yeah. So I kind of feel like they got lucky in that sense that they ended up on the same page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to me, it's an example of, hey man, working through a really huge problem, and that wasn't a showstopper. And I think, you know, a difference in religion like that could be a legitimately good reason to get out of a relationship.
Could be, yeah.
But it's also an example to me of, but you also can work through big things like that. And if you can work through big things like that, a lot of the smaller stuff too, you can work through it. Like it's not like they should all be showstoppers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that should not be showstoppers, you know, perhaps because you're going to deal with that kind of stuff or that level of stuff with like everybody.
Right.
Yeah. You just have to be willing to communicate and work through that together and not get into some of the Cold War that we're talking about, right?
And Yeah, and take responsibility for like your role in the relationship, right? Like I think the romance can make things feel very magical and make things feel very like fated, like the fate decreed this.
Yeah.
But we actually have responsibility, a lot of it, and for good or for ill, to make it work. Yeah. And again, you're right. It's not to say that. I mean, there are showstoppers and there aren't. But we have a lot of choice in the matter.
But I mean, if that had been a showstopper, I would have disappeared from the photograph.
Exactly.
You would not be here today.
To all you time travelers out there, careful around Paul's parents. We need them here.
I was listening to some podcast that was actually talking about Back to the Future, though, and they were kind of making light of the fact that they were fading from the picture. Like they were like, no, if the timeline had changed, you should just instantly disappear.
Yeah,
no, but
that makes sense.
the fading made it more dramatic.
Yeah.
At any rate.
Okay.
Neither here nor there.
No, but important.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on.
Sure.
So much of the rift between the genders can be explained by certain fundamental physiological differences. That's one of my premises here. As members of the same species, men and women are alike in most ways. For instance, in the excellent book, The Female Brain, which we've referenced here before, in which I've since read a lot more of.
Nice. So maybe you've read more than 75%. Like it was just about how much I've read.
No, that's still more than I've read. But
getting close.
There's a lot of great stuff in it. By the way, this is by Luann Brizendine. She's a medical doctor. She's well researched. This was very, I think it was a New York Times bestseller, and it's very good. She also has a companion book called The Male Brain, which I've not touched yet, but which I intend.
Yeah, me neither.
Anyway, and it's a very readable summary of what scientific research has told us about the female brain in the last several decades.
Sure, and to be fair, it's not without its criticism. Then
Absolutely,
there are those that feel like it's improper to actually call something a female brain versus a male brain. Partly because the similarities between male and female brains, they're highly similar.
That's right.
And they're dissimilar in fewer ways.
That's right.
But at least for me, my take on it is that there are real differences that are meaningful.
That's right.
Yeah.
They impact our relationships.
Exactly. That's my.
They're impactful. Just Bryce's favorite word.
Not a word. Not a word.
Is it not a word? It's not in your lexicon.
Yeah. So actually, she makes that point. She says that because there absolutely is a lot of nuance to this, and she does discuss the nuance. She says that 99% of genes of men's and women's genes are exactly the same. There's only 1% difference in our genetic structure.
Sure.
Nevertheless, there are some real differences which can matter in our relationships and in just how we operate.
Yeah, I mean, we also share a lot of our genes with rats, but as you can tell, there are some key differences.
Nope, I think that's a social construct. We are the same as rats.
If only rats had been nurtured in different ways.
Exactly, that's a nurture issue.
It would be exactly the same.
They'd be holding their own in society.
Exactly.
Glad
They'd
you
be
brought that up.
contributing to taxes and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Since they're freeloaders.
Yeah.
Anywho.
Okay, let's see. Okay, along those lines, right? There are differences that we observe that have to do with culture and upbringing and nurture. Nevertheless, based on the scientific and anecdotal evidence that I've encountered, at least, and I think probably for you too as well, I think the evidence that the existence of certain real deep-seated differences rooted in physiology is very strong.
Yeah.
That you can't, just because you don't like it or you think that maybe it's overblowing it, doesn't mean it
exist.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's true. I remember, I don't remember where I was listening to this, or reading about it, but it was talking about how, men have a higher percentage of autism than women.
Yep.
And it correlates.
I read that in the female brain.
It correlates with a certain part of the brain that men have that it tends to be thicker in men who have autism, and that part of the brain in women generally is thinner, but sometimes women have that part of their brain is thicker as thick as a man's, and
there are women with autism,
and the women that have that women that have that portion as thick that's like the average thickness of a man's, they have the same percentage of autism as men do. So,
okay.
So if you correlate it by that, if you just correlate it by regardless of your gender, how thick is this part of your brain, and your likelihood of autism is this percentage. But on average, women, that part is thinner than in men, so they have less autism. Yeah. And another part, I can't remember what I was listening to, but it was talking about how man or women making the decision. It was talking about some almond-shaped part of the brain or almond-sized part of the brain.
We'll talk about that.
Amygdala, and they were doing the same thing.
Which means almond.
It does?
Some language.
Does it?
Greek, I think.
Interesting. It probably looks like an almond. But in men, like the amygdala on one side of their brain would light up, and when women would do the same task, the amygdala on the other side, or it was like an almond shape. There were two of them, whatever it was, and so in women, it would the part of it on one side of the brain would light up, and on men it was the other side of the brain that would light up.
Yeah,
it would do the same task.
So Brizendine in the female brain, she points to how modern research and technology has discovered in a quote, an astonishing array of structural, chemical, genetic, hormonal, and functional brain differences between men and women. We've learned that men and women have different brain sensitivities to stress and conflict. They use different brain areas to solve problems, process language, experience, and store the same strong emotion. Yeah. By the way, sorry that I sound a little weird. For some reason, I felt the need to suck on some fruit snack in mid-recording session.
Well, maybe I'll just grab a Snickers over here and...
We're going to take a food break now for these men.
And I'm going to point out some of these other, like in this, she has this diagram of some other differences about talking about brain differences. Yeah. So the anterior cingulate cortex in the brain, it weighs options, makes decisions. It's the worrywart center, and it's larger in women than in men. Prefrontal cortex, this is the queen that rules the emotions and keeps them from going wild. It puts the brakes on the amygdala, which is the emotional center. It's larger in women and matures faster in teen girls than in boys by 1 to 2 years. And then there's other.
That's interesting.
The hypothalamus is the conductor of the hormonal symphony. It kicks the gonads into gear, starts pumping earlier at puberty in females. The amygdala, like you're talking about, is the wild beast within. It's the instinctual core, tamed only by the prefrontal cortex, which is, and it's larger in men. Anyway, just some examples. So yes, structurally there are differences. Do they determine everything? Do we observe differently? No, absolutely not. But
they do definitely
something?
Play a role, and we can see that.
Yeah. Sure. This might like a physiological explanation for why women may tend to worry about certain things more than men, but how they also are better at regulating their emotions
absolutely
than men are.
So she talks about how women's brains are deeply and continually affected by hormonal changes, and that can affect what's important to her from one day to the next, compared to man's neurological reality, which is a lot more constant. That isn't directly referring to what you're talking about, sure. But yeah, hormonally there's differences, and again, that's not to excuse anyone who. Anytime they don't like something a woman does, they can't just say, "Oh, she's being hormonal,"
Yeah. Men have hormonal differences too. They're just not as obvious as women do. Yeah, but that definitely affects the way we think about things.
Sure. Yeah.
And our brains are a little bit more wired for anger and stuff. And
yeah. So
aggression.
Brizendine, she also talks about how in the brain centers for language and hearing, women have 11% more neurons. And how the principal hub of emotion and memory formation, which is the hippocampus, that's larger in the female brain, as is the brain circuitry for language and observing emotions in others.
Right, which is why women don't ever forget.
and or like elephants.
In general, I've also heard that it's true that in general, like your brain perceives.
And all these statements are in general, because again, there's variation among the genders.
It's true
within the genders,
and it's also, I think it's generally true that your brain perceives, like at night your emotion is processing your memories and trying to decide what's important to stick in long-term memory and that kind of thing. Right? Some people think that's part of what's happening when you're dreaming, but in general, your brain perceives events that are tied to stronger emotions is more important.
Exactly.
And so it's like, gotta save that one.
Yeah.
In a million places.
That's right. That's an important function of emotions, is to tell us what's important and what's not.
Right. And so some of these experiences for women are more emotionally intense.
Right.
And they're seared in their memory forever.
Yeah.
And for a guy, they may not be as emotionally intense.
Exactly.
I don't know. My sister-in-law can remember what she wore on the first day of school, like decades ago, and I can't remember what I wore last week.
Sure.
Maybe it's different because I can't remember what I wore on the first day of school though ever.
And I'm guessing if we talked to her, she could explain the emotional context for that, why that was so memorable to her.
True.
Yeah. So some other stuff. Men have 2.5 times more brain space devoted to sexual drive, as well as larger brain centers for action and aggression. I think this goes a long way to explain, that finding that like men think about sex like frequently throughout the day, whereas a woman might think about it a few times during the week. That's not, it's not to excuse men for being pervs, but at the same time, this is part of our, the moving things forward, pursuing, action.
Is different, and it needs to be.
And it's not to say that women are all, passive, just sitting on your hands, or that they have no like interest in sex either, right? But there are some differences.
Yeah.
So some more. So the male brain has larger processors in the amygdala, which again, that's the core of the primitive part of the brain, which registers fear and aggression, and that's why a man can go from 0 to a fist fight so quickly. The male brain will perceive threats mostly of a physical nature, whereas women may see a few unpaid bills as a stress that appears to be life-threatening.
I was mentioning to these guys offline here how I'm going over finances with my fiance, trying to figure out how to pay for a wedding and all these things, and it's like a huge deal to me, and he's like, oh, it'll be okay, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
But to me, it's like such a big thing, and reading over this actually helped me understand why the difference is there between us and how I can kind of figure that out.
I imagine some of that is hormonal, and some of that is about the structure and interconnectedness of the relatively more interconnectedness of the female brain that you can't help but connect the dots. Like, hey, this puts our future family at risk. Right. This impacts your future career. Our lifestyle in the present. A man's thinking is relatively more simple. It's like, are we in danger of being eaten by a tiger? Right. No. Then
men have more unilateral thinking, and women think about all the things around them.
And honestly, that's a more informed and realistic worldview, I think.
They probably both have their good things.
Yeah, sometimes the man gets mad, tears up the bill, calls up the person sending the bill, and says, "You better watch out."
That's true. I'm gonna get you.
Well, it is an extreme example. That guy that sent the pipe bombs earlier this week. That was one of the things that he had done, is that he had actually, because of a bill, or I think it was because of his power or something, he had threatened to bomb somebody.
Yeah.
So that's probably more. A male is probably more likely to go to that extreme. Perhaps
it's my opinion that
that's
the negatives of these characteristically male traits are so obvious that it's easy, and because their emotional vocabulary, which we'll talk about more, is in general less developed. It's easy to scapegoat men and to blame them. They're easy targets, and the benefits, I think, of some of these differences might be less obvious.
Yeah, that's a good point. We don't think about the benefits. We hardly ever think about the benefits of
aggression.
Of the differences that bother us.
Sure,
if it's a difference that's bothering us at the time,
right.
We never think to ourselves like, is there a way that this is good though?
Yeah.
It's good for me.
And I would say, and I don't. This is something I'd like to study when I have some more time. But most entrepreneurs are men, and Paul and I both know this because we've both been entrepreneurs and are.
Yeah.
It's not that there aren't women who do that, but I'm sure that some of that is explained by men's more aggressive nature. They're willing to pursue things that regardless of risks, which maybe they should be scared of more.
Like, from a female perspective, whenever people get upset about the aggression men have, I always try to explain to them, but don't you want somebody who can protect your family and who's looking out for your family? Like, I'm glad that somebody has that, and I'm glad it's not me.
Sure.
As long as it's channeled properly.
That's the key.
Yep.
That's the key.
I do remember.
Frankly, a lot of, men don't necessarily channel it, effectively. What were you going to say, Paul?
We all have things we need to learn to manage.
Yeah. It just reminded me when we had a group that would watch Lost together, and the girls were all trying to decide, like, Jack or Saeed. And, and one girl said, "But you would feel so safe with Saeed." Because physically,
but he was so tormented inside. Is that who
He
you
was
want to be
tormented.
your emotional
I know,
confidant?
it's true. Yep. If you binge those in like a 2-week period, like I did, you start to find people saying the same things over and over again. Like Jack, in almost every episode, somebody would start telling him something, and he would say, "Why are you telling me this?"
I'm sure of it.
And that was like the dramatic, like.
But
response.
Jack, he was the man. He was the man.
Yeah.
That was a great show.
Anyways,
Wow, we're getting a lot of good product placement opportunity.
That's
Female
right.
Brain, Lost.
And did we mention Snickers yet? Anyway.
Yes, Snickers. Oh, and my fruit snacks I'm eating are Mott's.
Those are good ones. I like mine.
Yeah, these are good. Okay, I just want to say hit one more point before we hit our stopping point.
Yeah.
Okay, in the female brain, the circuit for aggression is more closely linked to cognitive, emotional, and verbal functions than is the male brain, which is more connected to brain areas for physical action.
Wait, can you summarize that? Like,
what does that mean?
Reword that in layman's terms.
The circuit for aggression is more closely linked to cognitive, emotional, and verbal functions for the female brain. Meaning
girls would tend to like talk it out.
So rhetoric.
Think through it.
well, their aggression looks different. It's not not that women don't have aggression. It's that it looks different.
It doesn't
more
turn to
heartful.
fisticuffs.
That's right.
Like,
And in the next time we'll talk more
Guys will go more-
about the book Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, where he talks a lot about that, kind of like the developmental difference in aggression with boys and girls. But basically, women's aggression looks different. It's more emotional. It's more verbal. So anyway, I think that's interesting.
True. They process things verbally.
Yeah, and colloquially, we call that relational aggression.
Sure, and thankfully the world is processing things verbally a little bit more than through military.
That's
stuff.
true.
Maybe
Fewer lives are being lost.
Maybe that's because
More-
women are taking a higher role in governments on average.
Sure.
Who knows?
I would argue that more people's feelings are hurt and their reputations tarnished on social media nowadays.
That's true.
I mean,
it has a
me
wider.
getting on my soapbox a little bit. Sorry, what were we gonna say?
Yeah, sure. No, that's true. You
Just
can,
like I
destructive in
think
other
I think
ways.
relational aggression is out of control on social media these days. And
yeah, man.
by the numbers, I'm not saying that men aren't capable of this or being mean on social media. They definitely are, but there's a lot of it is female relational aggression, I think, too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Anyway.
Okay.
Well, that's a stopping point for now.
Well, okay, we'll pick this up later, but this is good. I mean, basically, it sounds like kind of we'll get into this more in the next episode, but basically, kind of like the point of all this is that there are differences in men and women that are not anyone's fault. That are reasons why they can sometimes perpetuate this Cold War. Yeah. But there are things to some extent within our control, to some extent beyond.
That is
and they're
great.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll talk to you all next time.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Catch you next time.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing on iTunes or your favorite podcasting app and give us a rating. Thank you.